Hello, and welcome to another episode of Teaching with Inquiry Live. Tonight, we are specifically going to be continuing our October discussion topic on small group instruction, and particularly this week, we are going to be digging into the small group instruction and how you plan for it. And I will be completely honest, even myself, I find that sometimes planning for small group instruction can be quite overwhelming. And sometimes it is the main reason why I might not get any small group done, is because I'm busy lesson planning and doing whole group lesson plans. And then I'm finding it very overwhelming to then also plan for multiple small groups across different subjects, especially when I'm doing like language small groups in both writing and reading, as well as math small groups. So it's all a little bit overwhelming, if I'm completely honest. And so whenever I'm feeling overwhelmed, I try to put systems in place, and I try to put a routine and a structure in place, step-by-step plan that I can follow that's going to help me to make that a little bit more manageable. And I will create some templates. I will often create acronyms to help me keep things organized and to try to simplify that process so that it's more efficient and I'm not ending up spending a lot of my time just sitting in that overwhelmed feeling. So I wanted to kind of break down for you, as well as for me, the steps that I take when I'm planning the small group instruction and kind of how I work through that. Now, I will say that regardless of that overwhelming feeling, I know that I need to do it. And I was even reflecting today after a whole group lesson that frankly, the whole group lesson just really wasn't reaching the students the way I needed it to reach them. And I mean, I have a straight grade this year and I'm so used to teaching a split. And even with a split grade, I'm even finding my straight has a wider range of needs of students in my class than I've ever had in a split before. So I'm definitely not seeing a difference there. So I want to walk you through kind of the plan and the processes that I go through each week to get ready for small group instruction in both reading, writing, and math. Now, if this is the very first time that you are joining me, welcome. And apologize for the fuzzy hair. I was just lying down with my son, getting him ready for bed. But thankfully, he's asleep now. But my name is Patty, and I am I'm a 4-5 junior split grade teacher, except this year I have a straight. And I teach here in Ontario, Canada. And I am also the teacher behind madlylearning.com. And I come live every single Monday night to share with you about my journey as a teacher using inquiry-based teaching practices in my classroom, in the hopes that by sharing my experiences that I can perhaps save you some time and give you some ideas to work within your own room more efficiently and maybe take some of that stress away from you. So again, we're talking about planning for small group instruction. So I've broken it down into about 5 different steps that I go through that I kind of follow to help me plan. Now, I am a weekly planner, meaning that on Sundays or at the very latest Mondays, I will plan for my entire week all at once. It just saves me time as I'm really busy throughout the week running kids around all the place, that I don't have a lot of time to be sitting down lesson planning day to day. Plus, I found that if I'm lesson planning day to day, it actually takes me more time than if I just sit down for an hour or two on Sundays and plan out the whole week. So that is when I'm also planning my small group instruction. So step 1 is I have to group my students. The very first thing I do before I have small group instruction is that I need to group my students and figure out who's going to work well with whom. And I actually spent all of last week's video at 9 p.m. talking about all of the different ways that I can group students. So if you haven't seen that, you can find it here on my Facebook page, or you can find all of the other links, including the podcast or the YouTube rebroadcast, or as well as the blog post. You can find all of those links housed on www.teachingwithinquiry.com, and all of the links to the various ways that you can consume last week's episode is there. So the first thing I do is I group students. That's the big one. And if I'm ending up changing groups week to week as to who's going where, I'll decide that on Sunday evening as I'm planning. So step 2 is for me to finally make a plan about what it is I'm going to be working on with students. So I begin with choosing the main expectation that I will be focusing on. I look at the overall expectations, cluster a few of the specific expectations from our curriculum. So we have overall, and then we have some specifics that fall into that overall category. So I will generally choose an overall expectation for whatever subject I'm covering in the small group instruction. And then I will find 2 to 3 clusters of expectations within that overall that I can group together. And that is specifically going to be my look-fors and kind of my focus for that week. Now, one of the ways that I do that is I look at some of the previous things that we've been learning. So if we're looking at language, I look at some of the things that I've already modeled and done with my students in both modeled and shared instruction. And then looking at continuing that theme throughout my guided instruction. With math, I will often look at my themes that are happening right now in my week or the week previous, and I will go over perhaps a whole group lesson on, say, a Monday, and then proceed with small group instruction Tuesdays through Fridays with my students as we're beginning to roll that through. So I'm really looking at what skills students are ready to move in, something I've already modeled and taught in modeled and shared instruction, and I'm moving that through into the guided instruction. So again, I'm picking one expectation from the overall and then choosing a cluster of specific expectations that can be my look-fors. So from that point, I'm then looking at differentiating the instruction and looking at grouping my students. I generally look at 4 separate categories of students, whether we've got high, almost there, need a bit of reteaching, really struggling. And if I have those kind of 4 subgroups of students, then that allows me to kind of decide which lesson or which component of teaching needs to happen for each one of those 4 groups. So I'll show you what I was working on today for math. See if I can flip my screen here. Here we go. So there is my math plan there. And this would simply just be what it would look like as I'm working on my project-based math centers in the month of October. So looking at my levels, I call them stoplight, even though my students pointed out today that the stoplight's upside down and doesn't have an orange on it. But I have my lesson and then assessment are things that I'm looking for. So I will simply plan out those 4 different categories of lessons, and it'll be the same expectation, just different variations of sort of the same lesson and perhaps more scaffolded approaches for each of those groups. Obviously, these students down here are going to need the most support, and these students up here are going to need the least amount of support. So that is sort of how I will structure my thinking behind those planning. So when I'm coming up with lesson plans, I will make myself little templates that will help me to kind of structure my thinking throughout that piece there. And then the next thing that I'm looking at is I want to also, if I'm having small group instruction, I also need to be planning what my whole group is going to be doing while I'm working with the rest of the small group. So this often will predict that my students are going to be engaged in independent centers activities, because I need to have my plan with my students in the small group, but I also need to have activities for the rest of my class to be doing And frankly, they can't be sitting there coloring pictures and doing word searches or independent reading for that entire chunk of time. I need them to be engaged in rigorous activities that are actually meaningful. Otherwise, it's a management nightmare. So this third step that I will go through is looking, when I'm planning out what this small group instruction will look like, is I also have to factor in what the rest of my class is going to be doing while I'm with these small groups, doing some repeat and targeted instruction that highlights those specific expectations. So often it centers. So if I'm doing guided reading, then my students are engaged in literacy centers, which means they are self-directed writing, choosing what it is that they're wanting to write about and writing and drafting pieces of writing that interest them. They are engaged in a reader's response, which means that they will be given a text that they are to read, and then they will have to respond to that text, as well as they also have word work and looking at spelling and grammar activities that they should be completing each week. So that is what they're ending up doing when I'm with a small group in language. And it took an entire month to get them trained as to what those centers were going to look like. So we're just beginning some guided instruction very slowly as students are beginning to release some of their need of me in a day, so that I can actually work with a small group. And in math, I like to use also math centers. So having students engaged in different math activities. I will use the MATH math acronym to kind of code their centers. It gives me an idea of what it is that they can be doing in each one of those activities. So for math, I will use math on your own, which is knowledge and understanding questions that I can give them related to the topic that we're currently studying in math. So I will give them just your typical knowledge and understanding, short answer, not problem solving, just some practice type activities that would satisfy knowledge and understanding assessment. I will also, for the A, so if your acronym is MATH, the A stands for apply what you've learned. And this is where students are applying the strategies that we've been learning and solving problems. So it's a problem solving center. So it gives them word problems or a word choice, and they have to choose one of those problems to be solving or multiple problems to be solving, depending on how quick it is that they're able to problem solve questions. The T is time with teachers, so that's when that small group will come and work with me. And finally, there's always a hands-on center, and that will either be hands-on manipulatives or it will also be a technology center as well, where students might be completing stuff on the tech devices. So sometimes the hands-on will be math manipulatives, and then the devices will be used for the knowledge and understanding component, where I might do a quick assessment using, say, a Google Forms, or using Boom Cards, which is a digital flashcard program that students can use. So I will either have them using technology in the M center or in the H center, depending on what I have planned. So I will always plan those different activities and their practice. And I make sure that these are something that students have had lots of experience to do, that it is easy enough for them to do independently, and they have the knowledge and confidence that they don't need me to handhold them to walk them through that process when they're working on those centers. And while they're doing that, I am with a small group. Now, if you remember the 4 colors that I used in that page, I'll put that back up again. There we go. If you see the 4 colors there, if I'm looking at those that are in the green group, those students are not going to need me as much, so I will generally schedule them to not meet with me as often. I may meet with them initially at the beginning of the week, do a quick, give them some extra support, and push them a little bit further and give them an extra challenge initially, and then kind of set them off and let them go. And that's probably enough that that green group needs. And I could probably have them go ahead and do a quick 10-minute guided math with me at the beginning of the week and then check in with them for the last 10 minutes at the end of the week. And that's probably all that group would need. And I will often get students to self-assess which math group they might be in based on kind of their comfort and ability level to take risks and do all of those things. The yellow and orange group I'm going to meet more often, but not daily. The red group I'm going to try to meet daily, or at least the most in my schedule. I'm going to try to meet them the most often because they're going to need the most of my support, reteaching, a bit more hand-holding. They might be some of my students that are really struggling. I might be doing some gap closing activities with them because there might be some significant gaps in their math learning, or they may be on an individual education plan, but they're going to need my assistance more often. So I'm going to make sure that I'm scheduling more time with them during my week. So the structure generally of that is going to be, I will have Monday, even possibly Tuesday with whole group instruction, and then the rest of my week will be guided math activities where I'm not generally doing a whole group lesson. I think there was a question about whether or not this thing that I'm showing here is something I sell. It's not. This is just something I am putting together for my own. It would probably be eventually something that I will sell, but it's literally just a blank document right now and has nothing in it except some templates. I just made it look pretty. So I have files all over my computer of guided math lessons. I'm just trying to kind of put all of those together as I am structuring more project-based math as I'm learning and pushing myself to spiral instruction, which I'm not even going to get into right now because I'm still wrapping my own head around all of that as what that looks like in my classroom. So that is kind of how I'm thinking through it. Is I want to think through student groupings, and I want to think, okay, I've got to plan my lesson. So I pick my expectations. I pick the clusters of specific expectations that go along with that overall. I'm planning a lesson that will have kind of multiple entry points so that I have stuff for my lower learners, how I'm going to gap close for them. I have more touch points with those middle learners, and I have a few touch points with my higher learners, getting them as to how I can extend learning for that group of students. So I'm kind of having that differentiated instruction being built in there. Same happens with language as well. When I'm doing guided reading, I really like the ability to have the same text and the same text at multiple levels so that my lesson is the same. So if I have a text level that's at a lower reading level, so say a 30, and then I have a 40 reading level, and then I have a 50 reading level, then I can differentiate the activities by giving the student a different reading, but really my lesson is going to be the same, and the text is going to be accessible to a much wider variety of students. So I really like doing that with my guided reading, is having one text and having it at multiple levels so that I'm not planning all these separate lessons because I have separate texts. I've done that before. It is a little bit more work, so I much prefer to have one text and then have multiple reading levels for it. And I use a website called Readable, and Readable allows me to enter or copy text into their website, and then it gives me all of the reading levels and tells me where I need to change sentences or words within a sentence to simplify the reading level or make the reading level more advanced. So I will use that to change up my guided reading text, which sometimes I will simply get from a newspaper article if I'm using them simply for within my classroom and not as part of my resources that I sell on TPT. So that is the third step. So once I have my lessons planned, and once I have my plan, the rest of my classes doing, so those two components of my small group instruction, the next step is actually implementing it. Now, this is easier said than done because you have a plan, but things are going to happen And sometimes you're interrupted, things happen, you don't always get to the guided instruction. So this is where within a rotation, I like to keep a lot of open periods for some choice. So within a rotation, I don't like to jam pack my schedule with which groups I'm seeing when. There's always a group with me scheduled at all times. I like there to have a little bit of flexibility in there. So I will often schedule in what I call an open period where no one is actually scheduled during that time to come and sit with me. And I don't have a formal group during that time. There's always going to be times where, say, a student gets a concussion at recess and I am completely sidelined filling out concussion paperwork. And in the event that I'm doing that, I can't meet with a guided group because I have my students and they're working independently and it gives me a minute to actually fill out all of that paperwork. So I didn't have time to meet a group. Well, it's okay because I've got an open period later on in the week where I can still be able to make up that time. So I know for me, I need that flexibility built into my schedule to make sure that I am not so rigidly structured as to who I see when, that I do have a little bit of flexibility so that if I go over with one group, I can make it up later. And I definitely need that flexibility within my day. So sometimes your plan never goes as planned and you're constantly missing out on opportunities to see certain groups and you're always missing, then perhaps trying to schedule some open periods within your group rotations will allow a bit more flexibility for you to meet, say, with students that need it or to catch up with a group that perhaps you missed earlier in the week. And finally is my last step is assessment. So if we look at the cycle of assessment, the information, I can use a lot of assessment in my guided instruction. I can actually use that for reporting purposes. I can also use what they're doing during independent work centers. I can't use the information that I'm doing in a modeled and shared as well as I can with the modeled and shared lessons. I can't really take a lot of that assessment because in theory, I'm doing most of the work. So I'm not really assessing students. But I do find that the majority of my formative assessment is definitely coming from those guided pieces of instruction through the conversations that I'm having with students and all of those things. It's all really coming from that guided instruction. I also know that I need to do the guided instruction because if I don't, my students are never going to make the same gains as if I just am the one standing in front of the room all the time. So because I get most of my assessment, I need to come up with ways to accurately and quickly record that assessment data so that I can stay on top of it. Now, I will be the first to admit that my assessment collection is a bit of a hot mess. I mean, I definitely collect it, but I am not as rigid or organized as maybe I would like to be. And I will collect things on a device using tech. I will collect things by paper. I will simply have scrap notes that I throw in a file folder. Like, I am really a hot mess when it comes to organized assessment collection. Like, it's not there, and it's really frankly not pretty. It gets done, but it's not pretty. And I can definitely use it, but I certainly wouldn't want to open up my books and show everybody what the hot mess of my assessment actually looks like. But there's different things that I do to ensure that I can get that assessment data. Number one is I definitely have class lists. I have class lists stashed all over my classroom. My coworker actually takes a half of an 8.5 by 11, and it's the class list down the side, and she's got one or two boxes that she can simply just check mark, and then there's a little wider box for like a quick comment. And she has them like on a magnet clip, and they're clipped again all over her classroom. But because they're not full sheets of paper, she can get more of them. So she's not wasting quite as much paper, but they're genius. And I've started doing that too. So you have just a half page of paper and they're literally clipped everywhere. So anytime you need to take quick assessment or check who's handed something in, you've got those. So that's handy if you're just trying to check and keep track of who you've seen and maybe a quick note. So I have class lists. I will use color coding or numerical coding on my class lists that are for me, that will let me to determine really visually where students are. So if I'm meeting with students, I will color code, or I'll use a numerical code if I can't find my colors that day, about where they're sitting on that expectation. And if it's like, I'll use that stoplight, same code, green, yellow, orange, and red, to help me determine where they might be. And that helps me to give a quick snapshot of the class. So as I'm going forward and planning for next week, if I need to move students in between groups, I can definitely do that. I will also use tech tools like Adocio or Markbook or even Google Classroom to help keep me on track with some of the digital materials that are coming in. Or if I'm needing to take photos of student work, I will use Markbook, Adocio, or Google Classroom to be taking anecdotal evidence, especially with pictures. I will use those pretty regularly. I also will use a class list that instead of it being a list, I will have rectangular boxes, and each of my students have a name in one of those rectangular boxes, and I double side that page. This is a great sort of class page that allows me to take notes, especially if students are doing presentations. I know that's not small group instruction, but if I'm taking notes where I'm handwriting my observations on students, those pages where I've got a class list is going to be a lot easier. And then I also have a group book. I've done that a lot with guided reading. So students that are coming to me for guided reading, I will have their just one page just for that group. Their names are already on it, and I will just write notes or circle and check mark things that they were able to do in that guided reading session based on who came to my group. So group 1 were these 5 students. This is what I was looking for. Did they do it? Yes or no? And then some notes with those students. And then it's the same book every time I see that group. So those are a few of the assessment pieces that I'm doing. Really, at the end of the day, small group assessment is important, but it can be overwhelming when it comes to planning. And one of the ways that I have found it to be easier and more manageable for me to at least reduce some of the overwhelm, because there is more planning, is to come up with a system, almost like a process that I follow every single time to plan out what's going to happen. So language, I use a lot of choice boards, and I make sure that the independent work stays the same almost every single week. And I might change and tweak a few things, but the format is exactly the same every week. The same for math centers. The format is exactly the same every single week. I'm simply just modifying the small little details within each activity center so that I'm not recreating the wheel every single time. For independent reading and for math centers, again, I'm taking one expectation and I'm looking at what skills I need to teach to each leveled group as they come and see me, so that I can kind of be teaching the same thing, using the same materials, but teaching it either more advanced, or I'm doing some reteaching and rehashing of some of the previous lessons that I may have done in modeled and shared. So I'm hoping that tonight's talk is giving you some ideas about what you can do to help give yourself a structure and a process to cut out some of the overwhelm, so that you can actually get to actually implementing some small group instruction in your classroom. Don't worry if you're not there yet, though, because in all reality, it takes a while to get your students in the right mindset and the right work habits to actually get them to a point where you can sit with a small group and work. And it's all right if that takes you a little bit longer. If you're not there yet, be patient, take your time. You will get there eventually. It's just going to take a little bit longer, perhaps with the group that you have, but keep pushing towards it, because it definitely helps you to get the most bang for your buck in terms of gathering assessment data and ensuring that your students are getting the lessons that they need in order to be more successful in your classroom. So thank you so much for joining me. Next week in particular, we are going to be talking a little bit more about guided math and what that might look like in the classroom. I'm going to share with you some of my trials and tribulations as I am working through this own process in my own classroom. I'm going to share with you what I have learned about guided math, what things you should avoid, and what things you should maybe give a try, and why guided math might help you to differentiate your instruction a little bit more efficiently and effectively in your classroom. So thank you so much for joining me. If you want to make sure you don't miss a future episode, please go to www.teachingwithinquiry.com, which is this show's show page, so that you can get links to all of the different ways in which this show is rebroadcast every single week in a way that is easy for you to consume, which could be YouTube, a podcast, or reminders about when we go live. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next week. Bye for now.